What is up, WHAP? It is our final lecture of the year. That is crazy. We are finishing up with Unit 6, which is, of course, in the 1750 to 1900 time period. We are discussing the indigenous responses to state expansion, meaning how do the indigenous peoples respond in this second wave of colonization, the age of imperialism? How do they fight back the indigenous peoples to imperialism? We have gone through all of our key themes for this time period. We talked about the Enlightenment bringing on the revolutions in the Americas first with the American Revolution. The key date there is 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, brings over to France, and then the Creolist revolutions, all these things. Of course, we talked a lot about Industrial Revolution and its effects. And so we are finishing up with the age of imperialism. We know that it's going to have several effects on bringing wealth to the countries that are taking over many countries throughout the globe. Then how are people going to fight back? And so we go into the discussions of indigenous responses. We've gone over all of these key dates. When it comes to imperialism, some big ones to remember: 1842 with the end of the Opium War. That is the start of the economic imperialism of China with the spheres of influence. The Sepoy Mutiny is the end of the British East India Company's control over India, and now the British Raj, or the direct control that Britain has over India. And then finally, our Berlin Conference. This is where our European nations meet together to decide how to divide up Africa. No African states were invited on that one. Okay, Tupac Amaru II. Tupac Amaru II is an Incan ruler in a time where the Incas have been defeated for hundreds of years. The Inca were defeated by Francisco Pizarro, and he, of course, is a Spanish conquistador. That was in our first era of colonization. So the Inca have been ruled over. The descendants of the Inca Empire largely collapsed and it's being run by the Spanish, but the descendants of the Inca are living under Spanish rule. And so it's heavily maintained by the viceroys of South America. And the Inca, they don't have a lot of state power, but Incan rulers have a lot of community power. They have a lot of respect from the Incan people, the descendants of the Incan people that are still living in South America. And that's kind of where this guy comes in, Tupac Amaru II. He was one of the hereditary chiefs of the former great Incan Empire. So therefore he's a cacique. And he, despite receiving Spanish education and getting a Catholic education, he still identified more as someone of Incan descent. And because of this, he is going to start a somewhat of a revolution, a revolt against Spanish control in South America. He is going to use his influence to have a Spanish colonial administrator arrested. And then he is going to proceed to rally many peoples to come against Spain, especially the Creoles, and lead a revolution against the Spanish. The unfortunate side effect of this is that he is captured, he is arrested, and he is forced to watch his wife and his sons executed before he himself is executed. He's just a victim of timing. The Spanish, their empire does collapse, and they do collapse by all the Creole revolutions that occur just about 30 years later. He just tested the Spanish a little bit too soon, unfortunately. Another kind of strange occurrence that occurs in the Americas is when the French invade Mexico. So first of all, a little bit of context on this. The Monroe Doctrine, which is comes into existence in 1823 with President James Monroe. That was a warning to Europe not to come in and colonize the Americas. Do not come in and practice imperialism in South America, especially because the United States already has its eye on colonizing the Americas. Well, sure enough, that's exactly what this is. France is invading Mexico in 1863. That is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Why does France think it's capable of coming in and invading South America during this time, or actually Mexico's North America during this time, but the Americas in general during this time? And the answer is because the U.S. is in its own civil war. The U.S. is fighting its civil war between 1861 to 1865. And so France, led by Napoleon III, seeing an opportunity, comes in and invades Mexico. And he justifies this by saying that there were French people living in Mexico when the Mexican-American War went on between the United States and Mexico, and many French citizens' properties were damaged, and the Mexican government never paid them back. And so he's going to use this very flimsy excuse as justification to invade Mexico. And when he does this, he's going to force out the legally elected president, Benito Juarez, out, and he's going to instill essentially a puppet government, a government that is designed to be subservient to him. He puts in a European noble, Archduke Maximilian, in place, and he rules over it for 3 years. And then all of a sudden, the U.S. gets out of its civil war and immediately turns down to French-occupied Mexico and says, "Get out of there, or we're going to come in and push you out." This is going to embolden the Mexicans, and they're going to say, "No, we're going to push him out." Juarez leads a revolt against the French and push them out. And so this is one of our actual few times in this age of imperialism in which the group that is being colonized fights back successfully. The Mexicans do keep their sovereignty and push out the French. One situation in which the peoples that are being colonized do not fight back successfully is the Sepoy Mutiny. Now, originally it is successful, right? Because the British East India Company, you guys know the story. The Sepoys are using cow and pig grease in order to load their weapons. The Sepoys are going to rebel, and they are going to really end control of the British East India Company over India. But it's unsuccessful, of course, because who comes in and takes the British East India Company's place? Well, Britain itself, the country, the nation state, comes in, kills Indian soldiers, takes direct control. London now controls India. This is the start of the British Raj. But when we see that an entire state is controlled from another state, that's always going to lead in a birth of nationalism. When you're being told what to do from someone of a different nationality, this leads to patriotism and pride and wanting to rule yourself. This is nationalism. And so in India, this is especially epitomized with the Indian National Congress. Indian National Congress is especially started by highly educated Indians that attend universities in Europe. And when they attend universities in Europe, and this is true of this entire time period, that they're going to see ideas of the Enlightenment. And they see these ideas of equality amongst all people. Everyone has national rights. And so then they question, well, then why aren't we receiving natural rights in our own home territory? And that, of course, is going to give birth to more nationalism, where the Indian National Congress they're going to try and work with Britain to get more rights. They're going to air their grievances and argue for self-rule. And of course, who becomes president of that? Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, we also see in Southeast Asia, this becomes another target for imperialism. Already the Dutch have taken over the East Indies. That was in our first era of colonization. A new target in this time period is what we call Indochina. The French have come into modern-day Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and have seized this large colony for themselves. And the French are controlling over Vietnam, but the Vietnamese have their own government. They have an emperor, Ham Ji, and Ham Ji becomes emperor, and then his advisors who are speaking for him, he's only 12 years old, are speaking out against French control. The Vietnamese always are anti-control from a bigger state. You know, the Vietnamese gave the Chinese lots of problems when the Chinese tried to control them, and this is no exception to the French. And so they speak out against the French. The French are going to respond by capturing the young emperor and exile him out of the country to Algeria, which is in northern Africa, which is another French colony. And so another example of how Europeans especially dealt with indigenous resistance. We've talked about this one before. This is another situation that is very common, where we see indigenous peoples that are going to revolt or rebel against their European colonizer, and they're going to do it especially because they have received Enlightenment ideals. Give me 1 second. Hello? All right, sorry about that quick interruption. I had a dog issue. My dog crash was going nuts. Anyways, okay, so um, indigenous resistance in the Philippines is a perfect example of how we have indigenous peoples that go, in this case, Filipinos, that go and study in Europe. And this is going to show them the controversy, the hypocrisy of Europeans ruling over them and subjected them to less than equal rights, because they get exposed to the Enlightenment. So another situation, Jose Rizal goes and learns in Europe, comes back and starts promoting self-rule. We know what happens to this guy. He was arrested and executed, and that starts the Philippine Revolution. And then, of course, fatefully, the United States comes into the equation. The United States defeats the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. This is the United States' own imperialist war, looking to gain land from the Spanish, steal land from the Spanish in the Caribbean. There weren't really a lot of major battles in this one, to be completely honest. The battle at Manila Bay is in the Philippines. This is where the United States surprise attacked the Spanish there. This was George Dewey, the American general, who comes in, defeats 400 Spanish casualties, not in a single American loss of life in that one. And the Spanish are kicked out of the Philippines. And the Filipinos help the Americans defeat the Spanish in this one. And so the Filipinos absolutely believe that finally, after hundreds of years of Spanish control, that they're finally going to be free. But the Treaty of Paris doesn't allow their freedom. It transfers control of the Philippines to the United States. And so now the Filipinos, incensed, frustrated that this has happened, are going to now have to fight a new war against a more powerful enemy, the United States. Revolutionary leaders like Emilio Aguinaldo are incensed by this and are going to rally the cry of the Filipinos against the United States. And this starts a brief Philippine-American war. The United States, with more organized military, advanced weapons, are going to come in and is a nasty, nasty display of force. 20,000 Filipino casualties, 200,000 Filipino civilians died as the U.S. put Filipinos into prisoner camps and in order to stop them from aiding the revolutionaries. But this was the exact practice that the U.S. had condemned other countries around the world for doing, and the U.S. very hypocritical in this war. 4,300 Americans lost their lives, mostly to disease. And the Philippines remained a U.S. possession until after World War II, finally ending in 1946, ironically, on the 4th of July. Okay, so we also see resistance in Australia. So we know that the British came in and colonized both Australia and New Zealand. Australia was first a penal colony, then it became a settler colony after gold was discovered. New Zealand, always a settler colony. In this case, the first colony there was New South Wales. There were the indigenous peoples there are called the Aborigines. They, very much like our Native Americans, were in different clans, speaking very many different languages. They didn't have a centralized government. And the British come in and they initially say we need to treat the Aborigines kindly. We're supposed to only make treaties to come in and take land in New South Wales. However, just like our American colonists continue to drive west across North America, disrespecting their own government and taking lands from the natives, the exact same thing happens in Australia. The Aborigines are killed by British settlers, by better weapons, and of course by disease. Similarly, in New Zealand, the Aborigines, the Aboriginal people, the indigenous peoples, are called the Maori. The Maori are going to fight back to protect their land, their rights. Originally, a treaty is signed called the Treaty of Waitangi, where London, Britain, promises to protect the rights of the Maori people. However, once again, the British settlers ignore this, continue to move into what they consider to be available land. Of course, the Maori are going to fight back in a series of wars, and the eventual result is once again British settlers coming in and taking the available land in New Zealand away from the Maori. So really sad stories going on in multiple places around the world in which indigenous peoples are unsuccessful in fighting off imperialism. We'll see a lot of resistance against the British because the British were especially active in imperialism in this time period. Okay, what about Africa? There's a couple of distinctions with African resistance. One is that, for one, this is relatively new imperialism. When you compare it to other areas around the world, Africa was one of the last areas to be colonized because of especially disease, malaria in the interior of the continent. So why is that? Therefore, organized resistance to imperialism is going to develop later than, say, places like India, where colonization has already gone on since 1600 with the start of the British East India Company. The other reason why African resistance is slower to develop is because there are self-governments allowed in other places around the world. For instance, the Indian National Congress. Indian National Congress is educated Indian scholars coming together and arguing for better rights. The British allowed this to occur. The British allowed some parts of the government to be run by Indians. In Africa, however, because there was such a military struggle in that scramble for Africa, those African colonies aren't being run by diplomatic governments. Those African colonies are being run by military officials. And the indigenous peoples, in this case the Africans, did not have a chance to speak out in a governmental fashion against this imperialism. However, we did see nationalism rise, and that is called Pan-Africanism. African nationalism, the whole continent, it would be called Pan-Africanism. And we do have some specific areas of indigenous organized resistance. The first is probably the saddest of all. These are our Xhosa people in South Africa. Our history of South Africa, if you recall, the Dutch colonized South Africa first, 1652. They called it Cape Colony. Then came the British about 150 years later. They kicked out the Dutch. The Dutch had to move out of there, and they encountered several indigenous groups that they had to fight against, one of which was the Zulu. Another group in South Africa was the Xhosa people. The Xhosa people are not going to violently fight back against European imperialism. Instead, there was a religious movement, kind of similar to the ghost dance movement in the United States, and this one was our Xhosa cattle killing movement. The thought process is because the British cows came in and they had a disease that was making some of the Xhosa cattle sick, they thought that this represented that there were evil spirits that came from the British, and that if the Xhosa killed their own cattle, that this would rid the area of evil spirits and that they would remove the British. Now, the thought process was good. Unfortunately, the movement doesn't remove the British, and the immediate side effect is that there is a large famine that kills thousands in the area. So very, very sad stuff. The Zulu in the same area, South Africa, are going to fight back. They're going to fight back against the British. And in fact, they win an initial victory using axes and spears and some primitive rifles that they found from the Dutch. The British come back with much more reinforcements and defeat the Zulu in a series of battles, eventually adding that land to their large South African state, part of the British Empire. And then as we go up north and west, over to Western Africa, we come to modern day Ghana. And we saw the Ya Asantewaa War there, named after Ya Asantewaa, who is our warrior queen of the empire, our last actually African state that was led by a woman in this time period. And this area was very, very difficult. The Asante Empire was very, very difficult to conquer for the British. The British tried multiple times and were stopped multiple times by Asante warriors, fierce warriors. But when we get to 1900, the British are going to make a fifth attempt to come in and conquer the Asante Empire. And they're doing it for a couple of reasons. But one of the reasons was that there was the symbol of the Asante Empire, which was the golden stool. It was this down here, was this magnificent gold architecture that was the symbol of the queen's power or of the monarch's power. Ya Asantewaa was a very, very famous organizer of her people, and she said the British do not look at this as a symbol of our country. They look at it as a symbol of wealth to be taken. And so she organizes a rebellion against the British. Unfortunately, the British are successful. Ya Asantewaa was exiled, and the Asante Empire becomes part of the British Gold Coast colony as the British continue to imperialize and effectively subdue indigenous revolts. Economic imperialism is the idea where foreign businesses are coming in and controlling large parts of inhabited territories outside of their own country. We see many, many different countries do this. The best example is China with our spheres of influence, where we see China divided up amongst multiple European powers, and then multinational corporations come in and they control the raw materials there, they control all the business there, they sell to consumers there, and they make economic profits out of this. We see this in many different places in our age of imperialism. When companies come in, they often force their now new colonies to engage in cash crop agriculture or export economies, those sort of things. And so the main idea we have to get from this economic imperialism bit of this lecture is to know what types of economic imperialism is being used, where is it being used, and what type of crops are being manifested. In Africa...
Okay, I found this on the web for where it's being used and what type of
Oh boy,
crops are.
Siri's going
Check
off.
it
Give me a
out.
second. Shut up, Siri. Okay, so European imperialism in Africa. So before colonization, most farmers are subsistence farmers, meaning they're small farmers. They farm from themselves. They're raising crops just to feed their families. It's not big plantation agriculture, all these things. After colonization, now we've got this big plantation agriculture, large cash crops that are being sent to Europe for European markets. We also see that as far as trade, African states are still receiving the same kind of things that Europeans have been trading in Africa since our first era of colonization, manufactured goods especially. The problem of this is there's large negative effects for Africa. For one, African colonies, because they're getting all their manufactured goods from European powers, they are not manufacturing themselves. And now that they are being forced to only make a certain crop, especially if that crop isn't edible, they're going to be really subject to food shortages and famine, which sweeps through Africa in this time period. Okay, what were built in all of these colonies? What were some of the things that these colonies were forced to do, one of which was railroads? Previous to European imperialism, much of these places that are now targets of imperialism did not have many organized long-distance transportation networks. Of course, local communities had roads, but they didn't have large state-sponsored highways, railroads, canals, all those sorts of things. One of the ways in which Europeans are going to justify imperialism is by saying, here we are introducing railroads and canals in these places. We are developing their country. We are helping their country. That is an argument that Europeans would make in this. Of course, to build these things, they would utilize cheap labor, indigenous labor from whatever places they were in. And therefore, they weren't really helping these countries. They're benefiting themselves to help quickly export raw materials and import manufactured goods. And so that's a big effect of economic imperialism. Steamships, another very important piece in imperialism. We talked about this as far as in the Industrial Revolution, but it's also going to help Europeans move cash crops very quickly out of conquered states and move manufactured goods back in. And then with the creation of compression refrigeration equipment, meaning being able to keep things very, very cool, now we're able to ship perishables, especially meat. And this is going to give birth to the major meat industry, especially in places in Central America and South America that are developed to feed the growing middle class of Europe. The telegraph This one is going to help the mother country constantly keep tabs over their colonies. Therefore, for instance, the British introduced the telegraph to India to make sure that the colonial government in India was following over the orders from London. They would literally have these telegraph cables go under oceans. And this was some of the most amazing technological achievements of the era. The first transatlantic cable is completed. That's United States to Britain. That was New York to London. And then we actually saw England go all the way over to Australia with a cable, as well as Portugal to Brazil. So, more examples of the mother country connecting to their colonies. Cash crops changed the life of subsistence farmers. So again, subsistence farmers that are people that farm for themselves, that raise food just for themselves and their family. This type of living will change with European imperialism. Now we see subsistence farmers are forced to grow cash crops, particularly tea, cotton, oil palms for the palm oil for machines, rubber, and coffee. Of course, they're not grown for domestic use, they're grown for export. And we see that now that all of these, for instance, oil palms are being planted in Cameroon in Africa. The result of this is now there's less available place to grow food for themselves. And so we see food shortages. And with food shortages, we see the prices increase that leads to general deterioration of standard of living in Cameroon. Okay, we talked about this before. Meat becomes big business. Why does it become big business? Because Europeans especially have more money in their pockets. We see a growing middle class. We see a growing demand for meat. And because of this, especially with compression refrigeration on steamboats, we can now ship meat across the Atlantic Ocean before it goes bad, deteriorates. And so we see cattle ranching and sheep herding become big business in places around the world, especially, as I mentioned, in South America with Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. That's cattle ranching. And then because the British love their land, we see sheep herding become big business in Australia and New Zealand, of course, both settler colonies for the British. Guano becomes big business because with these huge cash crop plantations, you need fertilizer. You need to constantly be adding nutrients back to the soil to be able to use it again and again. Guano, of course, is bat droppings. It has the available nutrients that the soil needs to continue to yield crops. And so guano becomes a highly traded good, especially cultivated in Peru and Chile because of its dry climate. And of course, a terrible job in coming in and digging it out of whatever it is, especially in caves. And so indentured Chinese laborers were used as cheap labor to come in and do these jobs. And another example of how indentured servants are subjected to some of the worst jobs in this time period. Okay, cotton. So obviously, British economy is based off of cotton, especially after the Industrial Revolution. You can look at this date, 1721. So Britain is already looking to exploit the textile industry. They ban Indian cotton textiles. They don't want their colony, India, to be producing finished textiles. They want a monopoly on textile manufacturing, and that's exactly what they start to do. And because of this, they're going to force their colonies to send them cotton. They want all the cotton coming in from their colonies so that they can put them through their textile machines and form textile manufactured goods. Well, here we are in 1721, and so we're before 1776, which is the Declaration of Independence, which means the American colonies are still, in fact, colonies. They're colonies of Britain. Okay, so Britain's southern American colonies then become devoted to cotton. They must constantly be providing cotton for the mother country. In fact, during the Industrial Revolution, so throughout the 1750s all the way to 1900, most of that cotton is coming from the American South. But there's something that's going to change this. And that, of course, is the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Because the North commands the Navy, the North is going to blockade all Confederate ports, all ports of those southern states, so they can't export their cotton. They can't get it out. They can't trade with Great Britain. Because of this, Britain has all these textile machines. they're looking for a new source of cotton. The demand for cotton has risen, and so other countries around the world, especially countries close to Britain or British colonies, are going to devote their specific economies to cotton production. The biggest gainer from this is Egypt. Egypt is going to, especially under Muhammad Ali, is going to develop their economy so that it is state-controlled cotton plantations and make a tremendous amount of money by exporting cotton to Britain. Rubber is a very, very important resource in this time period. You need to use it from the sap of rubber trees, and these rubber trees can't grow everywhere. They have to grow in warmer climates, places like the Amazon rainforest in South America or in Central Africa. We remember that one of the first rubber plantations created was that guy King Leopold II, the Belgian nasty king that created that quote unquote free state of Congo. And so this time period is going to be a time period where indigenous states are forced to cultivate rubber. We see companies setting up huge plantations, especially in Southeast Asia. Typically, these plantations were some of the worst conditions for laborers. That's where the term rubber barons come from, off of the owners of these plantations that would do some really nasty things to workers that didn't meet their quotas. Obviously, King Leopold II would be a rubber baron. They're set up especially in Southeast Asia. Malaya, the biggest producer of rubber, that's a British-owned company. Indochina, that's French. And then, of course, the East Indies is Dutch. Palm oil, another situation of specifically cultivating a crop to aid mechanization, machines. Palm oil was used to keep machines from rusting, and so it was made from oil palms. And so oil palms needed to be planted in great volume. They're found in West Africa, and so because of this, Europeans are going to take these oil palm seeds and they're going to take them over to Southeast Asia. Why do Europeans continually go to Southeast Asia in this time period? Southeast Asia, there's a lot of workers looking for work, and we see the absence of minimum wage laws. We see the absence of health code regulations that are emerging in all of the home states of these imperialist countries. For instance, the United States. We have minimum wage in the United States. We have health codes in the United States that start to emerge as effects of industrialization. And so because of this, what does the United States, what do European countries start doing? They find the place where there's the lowest minimum wage or the lowest health codes, and they move their companies there. And so, that happens to be Southeast Asia in the time period. Ivory becomes real big business in lots of different things, especially ornamental carvings becomes coveted as a luxury item. And this is where the Ivory Coast gets its name because of this. Okay, Cecil Rhodes. We've talked about him. He's obviously a British man, business owner, and he is especially well known for his attempts to create a railroad from the very southern tip of South Africa all the way up to the northern tip of Africa, thousands and thousands of miles long. It's unsuccessful in doing this, but in his attempt to do it, he showed that cheap labor could accomplish amazing things by utilizing indigenous populations for cheap labor in their own continent, in that case. Where does this guy get his money to begin with? So he makes his money in the diamond industry. He's in the right place at the right time. He came into South Africa actually just to work in a textile mill with his brother. And then diamonds are discovered on his doorstep in Kimberley. And so he and his brother are going to move there. They purchase land very cheap initially, and then they form the De Beers Mining Company, which eventually has an absolute monopoly over the world's diamond production. It becomes the most fruitful diamond mine in the world. And at just 29, Cecil Rhodes becomes the most powerful man in South Africa. He uses his money to control politics there. He really starts to, and he was a complete social Darwinist. He was a belief that anywhere that the British race spread and imperialized, that this was better for the entire human race because it would spread what he thought was more of the best. And because of this, his racist views, especially in South Africa, we see that he becomes the prime minister there, so the top political figure, and he is going to institute some policies that continue segregation in South Africa, where blacks are treated less than whites and separate than whites, pushed onto the worst lands. And because of this, this sets the foundations for the really nasty segregationist government, the apartheid government, that made its way all the way until the 1990s, guys. So Cecil Rhodes, pretty nasty in that respect. Environmental effects, guys. We always need to talk at least a little bit about environmental effects of these changes of anything, industrialization, in this case, imperialism. Um, with imperialism, we see monocultures. Again, monocultures are countries or colonies that are forced to produce only one specific cash crop. By doing that, they have no agricultural diversity, which means they're only growing one thing. Because they only grow one thing, this has big effects on the environment. First of all, to clear out land for plantations, you need to cut down lots of trees. So you're going to have less trees. You're going to have less oxygen in the air this way, and you're going to have more human effects on the environment. Also, it depletes the soil big time. You see lots of the nitrates and phosphates coming out of the soil, especially cotton. It's really going to be ruinous to the soil. And that's going to cause a lot of things. It's going to cause, one, soil to not be used. It's going to cause companies to continue to expand in search of better soil, thus more monopolistic farming. And then if, God forbid, there is some sort of disease to the crops, or pests that come in, like this little creature over here is a boll weevil, and it was totally ruinous to crops, especially cotton. And if it made its way over into a cotton field, it might ruin your harvest. And so if that happens, then you might find entire indigenous populations out of a job or suffering to make money. And so this is really, really dangerous to have just your entire economy based off of one particular crop, which of course is a monoculture. And then after the fact that once these countries or colonies eventually become independent themselves, they have to deal with the fact that their soil, that their land, all the trees were chopped down. They were suited for plantation agriculture, and they're going to have to try and re-diversify their land, which is very difficult to do so. And because they weren't growing enough food, they had to constantly be importing food, which of course was lots of taxpayer money to do so. Okay, we've talked about the Opium War a million times. The one thing I'm going to point you to on this one is that it's 1842. That is a date that you should know. I'm going to try to keep hitting that home for you guys because that really is the start of the age of imperialism. That's really the first element of this new age of colonization. Of course, it's also the start of imperialism in China, where we see British are going to come in. They're going to demand more control of Chinese ports. They get Hong Kong, so that's direct imperialism. But what I want to focus on now is spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is where different, in this case, British companies are coming in and controlling over areas of China in their particular sphere of influence. And these companies are going to hire Chinese laborers to work very cheaply, and they're going to exploit the labor and the wealth from that specific place. These are these transnational companies that develop. The United States is late to the game of imperialism in China, especially because the year before they fought that Spanish-American War. So John Hay comes in, Secretary of State, and is going to organize the open door policy so that the U.S. can have free trade in China as well. Speaking of the United States, we're going to talk a lot about Latin America here for a second. And when speaking of Latin America in this time period, 1750 to 1900, it is very difficult to not discuss Latin America without discussing the United States. Because the United States, after that Monroe Doctrine in 1823, is looking to Latin America as areas that the U.S. can expand into. The United States, heavily imperialist power in this time, especially in the Western Hemisphere, protected by that Monroe Doctrine that stated that no European country should come in and colonize the Americas. And we see many examples of this. The Mexican-American War, the U.S. provokes war with Mexico and steals land all the way from Texas to California. Spanish-American War, the U.S. provokes a war with Spain, steals Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines, added to the United States. Then in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt, he's going to issue the Roosevelt Corollary, which is essentially an addition to the Monroe Doctrine that says we don't want European powers coming in and colonizing areas in the Caribbean, especially if they fall into debt. And so what we're going to do is if a country falls into debt to a European power, we're going to preventatively intervene, meaning we're going to invade that country first. We're going to take over their economy, and we'll make sure that a European country gets back its debt. But really, it was justification for the U.S. to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. This political cartoon right here is a ironic cartoon here that says peace in Latin America, and it's got a whole bunch of warships coming in, and that's Teddy Roosevelt's face arriving. This is obviously a play at the irony of the Roosevelt Corollary down here. Okay, Latin America in the new time period, however, when I say the new time period, after the Mexican-American War, becomes a target of new imperialism. And what that means is no longer is the United States coming in and directly conquering land in Latin America, but they are rushing in to capitalize on their markets and their raw materials. This is indirect economic imperialism instead of normal come in, steal your land imperialism. This means that businesses, transnational businesses, are coming in and they are buying land in these respective places to control some of the wealthiest and most luxurious parts of these countries. A great example is Mexico. The United States oil moguls, big businesses, are going to come in and buy the land that's rich in oil in Mexico. And by controlling these oil-rich lands, you're going to make billions and billions of dollars. And this isn't even American land. This is Mexican land. And so that's an example of how economic imperialism can strip lots of wealth from a specific place. In this case, Britain, once again, is going to come in and really target Latin America. British companies are going to come in and invest in a lot of different countries in order to extract wealth from these places. Europeans in general are going to invest 10 billion in Latin America, Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil, the countries involved. And the biggest place where Britain invests is Argentina. Argentina has lots of available land. It's actually underpopulated. And because of this, there's lots of available land to create large farms called pampas. And these are going to be farms that are going to provide cattle ranching, meat coming back to Europe, which Britain correctly realizes has a huge market in Britain right now. Also, Britain is going to give money, or I should say British companies are going to invest by building railroads and telegraph systems there. Again, not doing it to help Argentina, doing it to help their own business interests. And by doing all these things, it's going to quickly allow Argentina to handle massive exports of raw materials back to Britain, and also bring in lots of imports of British manufactured goods. So this is your classic imperialism, just done through economic ways. Brazil is a story of how European imperialism can ruin a country with trends in the world market. Brazil is going to look at the growing trend for rubber. And American companies and British companies and other European companies are going to come in and they're going to invest a lot of money in Brazil because rubber can only be grown in a couple of places, especially warmer climates. And this is perfect for the rubber industry. And so many European companies are going to buy land there. They're going to pay people there to harvest rubber. And to do that, they're going to have to cut down trees. They're going to have to create these rubber plantations. And then colonization in Southeast Asia began. And now Europeans see an opportunity to pay people less, laborers less, and still produce the same amount of rubber. So these same corporations that have invested all this money in Brazil are going to pull out of Brazil and they're going to go over to Southeast Asia. Now, with all this European money leaving Brazil, what's going to happen is the Brazilian rubber industry is going to plummet. They're going to go through poverty and problems, where over in Southeast Asia, these areas start to flourish. And so it's an example of how Europeans can drastically create wealth in a place and then just as quickly ruin that place by pulling out of their investments. And then we got the term banana republics, and this comes from a really, really specific form of economic imperialism. And our AMSCO book gave us a really good example. So I'll use the United Fruit Company. So this is an American corporation that it existed until very recently, only 2013. Um, and so this American corporation is going to look for items that are be able to be grown in Central America, and then sold in high demand in places like the United States or Europe. And so one of these such things was tropical fruits like bananas. And so these corporations come in, like the United Fruit Company, they're going to buy lots of land, and they're also going to make deals with people that own a lot of land already, like wealthy landowners. And they're going to say, okay, here's the deal. We're going to give you a huge cut. We're going to give you a cut of how much money we're making if you devote your land and resources to the production of bananas. Um, and so the landowners are making lots of money. The corporations making lots of money. The American corporation, British corporation, in this case, American corporation, the United Fruit Company. And then, of course, they're going to be exploiting low-wage workers in these places. Now, the workers, just like any other place in the world, are going to demand better rights. They're going to join labor unions. They're going to advocate for themselves for health codes, minimum wage, workers' compensation, all of these things. But in this case, because there's so much money coming in from these American corporations are going to work with the wealthy landowners in these places to either pressure governments or bribe governments to keep the wages really low in these countries. We don't want to have to be paying our workers more. So if we can bribe the government, we're going to be able to save money. And that's exactly what these American companies start to do is it's a banana republic is a term for a Central American country that is actually at the mercy, at the will of these transnational companies, these foreign-based corporations that are influencing their government. And that's a perfect example of how economic imperialism can affect politics with the creation of big business. Okay, the other last major thing that happens in this time period is a change in labor systems and migration. We talked from 1450 to 1750 all about transatlantic slave interactions. You see that time period, the slave trade's going on, especially that West African slaves are moving to the Americas. However, in 1807, the slave trade is banned. And that means that slavery is slowly going to be abolished throughout the world. In some places, it takes longer than others, like the Americas, especially the United States. But eventually, slavery disappears. And so now, with this new age of imperialism, you have all these new plantations. Who's going to work on these plantations? The answer is largely indentured servants. Indentured servitude makes a huge comeback in this time period because it's cheap labor that's being provided for these plantation agriculture, these cash crop plantations. And then we'll also see places that are going through economic hardship that are looking for available work, and we'll see voluntary migrations from there. Places like India, China, and Japan. Japan, a little bit different. They're going through just overpopulation. But China and India going through some bad economic situations. So this is essentially what I just described. When slavery declines, indentured servitude makes a comeback. Talked about the international slave trade being banned in 1807. What were indentured servants again? Let's do a little recap. These were people that worked for a set number of years. Usually it was 5 to 7 years. And they couldn't afford to pay to go over to wherever it is that they were supposed to be working. So the business paid for them to do so. And then they had to work for free for 5 to 7 years to pay off that voyage, the expense of that voyage. Who are the people that would be willing to go to this new place and work for free for 5 to 7 years? Usually it's going to be people that have no land for themselves, no wealth for themselves, that are willing to work for 5 to 7 years and then be in a place where there's available land or available upward mobility. And so especially India is a great example for this because India is controlled by the British. The British are heavily diminishing India's economy. So India is going to move to a bunch of British controlled colonies, largely by British controlled industries, And so then they can work for free for 5 to 7 years, but then find available land and opportunity. In general, guys, the two biggest reasons why you see migrations in world history, whether it be emigration, immigration, migrations, is for land and opportunity. This is what everyone's looking for: land and economic stability. Of course, whenever there's migrations, there are shifts of culture, syncretism, and diffusion of culture into new places. Okay, Asian contract laborers, many indentured servants are going to come from India and China. Those are two of the most places. Of course, Indians are in Asia, South Asia, so there's Asian contract laborers. Most of the time, this was willfully done, meaning they went into these agreements on purpose. Sometimes, however, British corporations or any European or American corporation tricked laborers into entering a contract they didn't fully understand, and sometimes they would be forced into servitude in this way. But nonetheless, Indians and Chinese moved throughout the world into these colonies, wherever these colonies were needed, where laborers were needed, especially in the Caribbean. The Caribbean, with now the abolishment of slavery, the Caribbean had so many slaves that were working on those plantations. Corporations now looking for new laborers, and so we're going to see Asian contract laborers coming into the Caribbean to work. For instance, Cuba, massive, massive sugar plantations there. We saw 125,000 Chinese indentured servants going to Cuba to work on those sugar plantations. Depending on the place, their treatment could be essentially as bad as slavery was for the descendants of the West Africans that had worked on these plantations for years. We also see different migrations because of the establishment of settler colonies, or in this odd case, the establishment of a penal colony. You know, Australia was first founded as a penal colony, and so one of the first migrations that we see here in this late 18th century is the movement of convicts, the movement of criminals to southeastern Australia, that we saw, forced by the British to do so. And then when they came there, of course, to work off their crime, they had to build roads and railways, somehow improve the infrastructure of Australia. Of course, eventually, when gold was discovered, Australia becomes a settler colony as many people move to Australia because it's quite nice. Okay, diasporas. What is the definition of diaspora? It's a mass immigration from a country, a continent, where it takes place over many years, and we see this movement of peoples, and they bring with them a large influx of their culture, of their traditions, of their language, of their religions. And we've seen many of these throughout history. The two biggest ones that we discussed so far are the Jewish diaspora and the African diaspora. The African diaspora, of course, was a result of the transatlantic slave trade. However, in this time period, we see four different diasporas that we focus on. The first is the Indian diaspora, of course, South Asia, and the main reason is poverty. We see that with British control over India, there's not a lot of room for economic opportunity, and thus Indians would be more willing to move to a British colony in which there was more land or opportunity. The thought process is they can move to a new place. They might renew their contract, meaning pledge themselves to work for another 5 to 7 years in the promise of land in their new home. So let's say we see Indians coming over to, this place in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, you're now there. You've worked for 5 to 7 years just to pay off your trip. Then you could work another 5 to 7 years to get in exchange some land. And so we see that this happens. Over 1.5 million Indians shipped to colonies around the world, especially Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Finally, in the middle of World War I, do we see this process end? So this goes on for a very long time. And of course, with the movement of Indians, we see the transfusion, the diffusion of culture. The Chinese diaspora, very same scenario. The Chinese are going to go through massive levels of emigration for a lot of reasons. One of the big ones is the Opium Wars and the colonization of the spheres of influence of China. Also, the Taiping Rebellion, which causes massive famine. That's even bigger reason for emigration. And with this famine, lack of land, opportunity, we see Chinese leave the country in search of more land and opportunity. And thus, gold rushes provided an interesting opportunity for them, not only to mine. In fact, the Chinese rarely mined, but they would come in and knowing that there would be a new influx to a new place, they would know that there would be markets there, or at least services there that weren't provided. A great example is, coming over to California. California newly taken in the Mexican American War when gold is discovered there. Mexican American War ends in 1848. Gold is discovered the following year. California is off in the western portion of the continent, and there isn't a ton of roads built there. There isn't a ton of markets or cities built there in California yet. This is relatively new, and the Chinese see an opportunity, knowing this is going to be a highly developed place with lots of people, lots of consumers. If they can immigrate there, get themselves on some land, they can make a profit, and that's largely what we see with the Chinese following the gold rush in a very smart way. And one of the major markets that the Chinese find in the United States is the building of railroads, especially the Transcontinental Railroad, which connected California to the rest of the United States in that same context of the California Gold Rush. Some Chinese paid their own way, others were indentured servants. A lot of them were male, and actually, that's really true of most indentured servants. They're going to be male. They would send back what you call remittances, which were foreign earnings sent back to their families. And some planned on making a bunch of money and then paying for their families to come over to their new place. Okay, millions of Chinese also made their way into Southeast Asia, overpopulation, and then of course those two things I already talked about, the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. And Chinese did very well in Southeast Asia. Many of Chinese families owned massive companies, made lots of wealth for themselves. Okay, the Irish diaspora, probably one that you're more familiar with than others. The biggest cause for this, the British are directly controlling Ireland. They're going to abolish their parliaments. And then Britain, as we know, all the way since Henry VIII, have been Anglican, the Church of England. But because they're imposing control over the Irish, Catholics are persecuted. And so, because of this, for political and religious reasons, the Irish would leave. But primarily, the biggest reason is because of the potato famine, which the Irish country became very dangerously connected to. And because of this, a fourth of the entire country is going to starve, and then 3 million are going to emigrate out of Ireland and look for a new place to live. I believe that the current population of Ireland is 8 million. So this is 3/8 of Ireland, probably a higher proportion then, leaving the country in search for a new place. Many went to the United States. And when they came to the United States, they were coming with very little. Our Irish immigrants, they have very little because of political discrimination by the British, because of the potato famine. The Irish are making their way over to the United States with nothing in their pockets. And when they arrive on the east coast of the United States, they're going to immediately look to find a job. And because of this, the Irish are mostly going to congregate on the eastern portion of the United States in major cities like New York or Boston. And because of this, they're going to start to control a large amount of politics over in Boston and New York, and find jobs. The problem is the jobs over there in New York and Boston, those really industrialized areas, are going to be in factories. A lot of Irish work in factories, or they laid railroad tracks. Okay, Italian diaspora. Italy, as we recall, unified in the 1870s. They went through these massive wars of unification. That was Count of Cavour, trying to unify Italy together. Lots of wars, realpolitik, nasty stuff. And because of this, Italy immediately was plagued with lots of debt, and there are also lots of destruction in the country. And because of this, many Italians because they were poor, went to other countries in Europe, especially, or came over to the United States. Or another place they went was Argentina. Argentina became a big destination for Italian immigration because of all the available land and opportunity in Argentina. Japan is going to go have a significant amount of migration because of their shift in their economy. Japan really became an industrialized society very, very quickly. They promoted an agricultural tax, which mean that we had less people farming, more people moving to the factories. But because Japan was already very heavily populated, less people farming means surplus population, very difficult to feed its population. Um, Migrations are going to reflect this too much population to feed in this time period. 1893, Japan's going to establish the Colonization Society, where it's going to attempt to send people around the world to form little agricultural societies to send food back to Japan to help feed their population. They tried one in Mexico, it was unsuccessful. That's going to be a big reason why their invasions in World War II. For instance, the invasion in Manchuria in 1931 was looking to form the what they call the rice paddies for Japan, the colonization of mainland China to feed Japan. There's other examples. Japan sends contract laborers to Peru. Thousands are going to come to the United States. So many to the United States that the United States is actually going to make an agreement. This was Teddy Roosevelt again, who was a social Darwinist. There was lots of nasty relations, especially in California, where Californians were complaining that the Japanese were coming in and taking the best land and opportunity. And so American citizens lobbied so hard to the US government to restrict immigration that Teddy Roosevelt made an agreement with the Japanese government that said, let's make this agreement that you will restrict passports so that no further Japanese immigration will come into the United States. This is especially influenced by social Darwinism and racism. And this is very characteristic of the United States, guys, because this is essentially restricting Japanese immigration, although it was an agreement to do so. And then in 1882, the US had completely excluded Chinese immigration with something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And yet while we're not restricting Irish or German or other immigration, we are restricting Asian immigration. And so that obviously shows the persistence of racism and social Darwinism. One of the places, however, that was exempt from the Gentleman's Agreement and actually received high Japanese immigration before the Gentleman's Agreement was Hawaii. Hawaii received lots of Japanese immigration to work on those sugar plantations and pineapple plantations. And because of this, we saw a high Japanese population in Hawaii. One of the reasons why the U.S. made a move to annex Hawaii was fear that Japan was going to annex Hawaii. And of course, today, Hawaii has a very strong Japanese culture because of this influx of Japanese migrants, especially agricultural migrants. What are the effects of all of these different migrants coming to these different places? Well, we're going to see that it's going to have effects, obviously, on their new home because we see the bringing of culture. Migrants are largely going to form ethnic enclaves, which are places in which they try to preserve their home culture in their new home. That's an example, like Chinatowns, for example, or Little Japans, those sort of things, Little Italy's, also, they'll have effects on the place that they left, largely because lots of males left. Sometimes there would be opportunities for women to take the jobs that were previously held by males. So they did have immigrations in both places. We've talked about ethnic enclaves before, of course, but this is where immigrants are coming in. They are trying to preserve the culture of their home country. They speak the same language. They eat the foods. They honor the traditions, the religions, etc. And so this was an opportunity for immigrants to maintain their own culture and also infuse their own culture into their new place of home, of living. Um, we especially see Chinese enclaves thrive in Southeast Asia. As I mentioned before, the Chinese were very successful in immigrating and creating opportunities for themselves in Southeast Asia. They were more accepted in Southeast Asia than in other places of the world, such as the United States. Because of prevailing racism, as I mentioned, in Indochina, which is modern day, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Chinese came in with experience of trade. They were allowed to trade in their colony in Malaya. We saw lots of business owners control farms there and opium production, which is not good. And then in the Dutch East Indies, they made their ways into several government positions. And so many Chinese became wealthy in Southeast Asia. They started to control more of the economy there because of the huge amounts, the sheer amounts of Chinese immigration coming down into Southeast Asia. India, we saw large amounts of Indian migration to different places that are controlled by the British, especially in places in Africa. Mauritius, which is not a place we often talk about, is an island off the coast of Africa. That is a place that became a very profitable colony for the British. And we actually saw almost 500,000 Indians going to this island to produce cash crops there. Natal, which was a colony in South Africa, and Kenya, especially to work on the railroad. All of these places now have significantly high Indian populations and have Indian cultures, bringing with them their religion, of course, especially Hinduism. The Kangani system is a system that comes to replace indentured servitude. And what it was essentially a more humane indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a kind of a nasty system in the sense that indentured servants would be very lonely. They'd be by themselves. They largely would live in an attachment to the house of the owner, or if it was owned by a large corporation, they would be living in these small dormitories. And it was very difficult. They didn't have a lot of independence. They didn't have a lot of time for themselves, living in a company owned structure. And because of this, the Kangani system was a way to encourage migration in which the migrants would be more happy because entire families would be recruited to go and work in these imperialized areas. But the workers would be more happy with this because they would live less restrictive lives. They would not be living with the owners. They would have a chance to, be with their family and engage in leisure activities on their time off with their children, etc. And so the Kangani system was a way in which, especially Britain, was able to continue indentured servitude for longer as more and more countries started to restrict it because of its social rights practices. Okay, Irish enclaves in North America. This is something I was talking about a little bit earlier. Because Irish immigrants came with very, very little in their pockets. They oftentimes didn't have the money or the resources to buy land further west. And so most of the Irish immigrants settled in these northeastern cities, such as New York, such as Boston. And they then, in these cities, because this is during the Industrial Revolution, would work in factories, largely as unskilled laborers, or they would work on the railroads and they would move. That's what brought our Irish further west, especially as we start to see some bigger numbers out in California, laying the railroad tracks across the country. Obviously, we have examples of Irish culture, St. Patrick's Day, Irish music. I just attended Sean's Run virtually yesterday, and it's wonderful. Lots of Irish music, Irish celebration. It was awesome. The Irish are going to have the political effects on the country, especially because if they group all in one city or one state, they're going to have a sizable vote, an Irish vote, and so they're going to promote things that help the Irish. In that case, labor unions, the rights for workers, especially unskilled workers, and so that is going to have a serious role in American politics in the time period as well. And then last but not least, Italians in Argentina. We know Italians emigrated out of Italy because of the nasty wars of unification. And because of this, Argentina was a big destination for Italians because Argentina was underpopulated and wanted more people coming in to work on their lands. And so they encouraged immigration and guaranteed the rights of Argentinians to any immigrant. And because of this, because of the time period, Italians saw opportunity in Argentina and immigrated there in huge numbers. A startling fact is that today Argentina's population, 55% of it is of Italian descent. We see many different languages that are, excuse me, Italian influence on many of the Argentinian words. Also, in Buenos Aires, which is the largest state over here on the coast, Italian is spoken as the primary language there, and so obviously we see some major effects here of Italian immigration into Argentina, and our three major reasons why Argentina was underpopulated: cheap lands, wages are higher, and the cost of living was lower. Guys, in general, when you see immigration in world history, the biggest reason is for land and opportunity. The second big reason is to escape persecution, whether it's political or religious. And that is, our tale of immigration in world history. And guys, that is it. That is all the content for WAP that we will be tested on. We have done it. We have a DBQ assignment. I will remind you, it is an individual DBQ. I would ask you guys, if you have the time, and we do, we have 45 extra minutes. Time yourselves, guys. Try to do this DBQ by yourself. If you do it and you submit it, even if you didn't quite finish your counter argument, I will give you a 3 out of 3 perfect score just for writing the essay itself. You can do the DBQ outline, but I will grade it as normal. You won't get an automatic 3 out of 3. Just one more reminder, it is an independent assignment. It's not done in partners. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow, which is Tuesday night, for the practice test. I'll send more information on the reminds. Miss you guys. Love you guys. Talk to you soon.